Ever since its formation in 2002, TNA has gone through a lot of ups and downs. But one thing which has remained consistent throughout that period is that there has always been a standout performer for each year. But just who was the best wrestler of every single year since the company began? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Impact's Best of 2002, AJ Styles. Yes, when TNA was initially formed back at the start of the 2000s, it was largely built on the remains of World Championship Wrestling. And that was exactly why you had people like Jeff Jarrett dominating the main event scene. But he wouldn't be the guy fans were most focused on back then. No, fans were far more interested in a rookie here, one who went by the name of AJ Styles. Why was that? Well, because pretty quickly it became apparent he was the person who was going to be stealing the show at every event during those early Asylum years. Hell, there's a reason the Phenomenal One would become the inaugural X Division champion at the promotion's second ever show that June, just as there was a reason he'd also win the NWA Tag Team titles with Jerry Lynn at the follow-up show TNA held after this. What was that reason? He was just that damn good. So good would AJ be, in fact, he'd still be the top performer in the six-sided ring by the time 2003 came around. Of course, come 2003, Styles was that little bit more experienced and established, and this was what allowed him to rise to an even higher level than he had in 2002 when he became the first ever Triple Crown champion in TNA. That's right, after having won the X Division and Tag Team titles the year prior, it would be here that AJ reached the top of the mountain. Sure, it wouldn't be the TNA World title as such, because that title didn't exist yet. Rather, it would be the top belt of the governing body which Impact was affiliated with at the time. Obviously though, with that belt, the NWA World's Heavyweight title, being part of a lineage which stretched all the way back to George Hackenschmidt, it put the Phenomenal One in a special tier. And this was all the more impressive given how young he still was back then. But while this could have been too much weight for some rookies to bear, AJ Styles would continue to go further, as in 2004, he'd still be the best wrestler in TNA. What could the Phenomenal One have possibly done in 2004 to up the ante even more? Well, how about winning the NWA World's title for a second time? And as if that wasn't enough, it was also here that AJ would have excellent feuds with the likes of Chris Sabin and Abyss, ones which were going strong as the promotion entered into its first national TV deal with Fox Sports Net. Needless to say then, if there had been any doubt before who the ace of Impact was, this was the year those doubts were fully put to bed. Really, come 2004, it was so clear that AJ was the guy, it felt like all the company had to do was strap a rocket to him and see if this would help them reach that next level of overall success. And that was even more evident when, during the months where he didn't have the world title around his waist, Styles was continuing to build the X Division into the most exciting division in North American wrestling at the time. Would he be able to keep this momentum going into the next 12-month period? Why, yes he would, and that's why he's also our choice for Best TNA Wrestler of 2005. Now we know that it might seem unfair to keep giving this accolade to AJ Styles, as there were plenty of other great wrestlers on the TNA roster back during those early days, particularly in places like the X Division. But really, the Phenomenal One continued to be a level above everyone else here, even the mighty Samoa Joe and the incredible Christopher Daniels. So there could be no other choice than him, as with the 2000s hitting their midpoint, there was no one else who could match him. And all of this would be evident during his famous triple threat bout against those two other aforementioned performers at the Unbreakable pay-per-view in September of that year. A match so good that even to this day, many consider it the best Impact has ever put on. Sure, Joe and the Fallen Angel would also play a large role in that bout being as great as it was, but the secret sauce for many remained Styles, as he was able to do things physically which few, if any others around him, could. Would he be able to make it 5 in a row in 2006 then? Well, no, as it happens, because that year, he'd finally be usurped by the Samoan submission machine himself. Now, Samoa Joe was no stranger to a TNA ring come 2006, as ever since the prior summer, he'd been working in the six-sided ring to a high level, most notably during the iconic three-way bout. That said, it was here that he fully rose to the top of the pile, because after establishing himself to this new audience, he was able to take things to the next level, not just for himself, but for the company in general. How did he do that? Well, when Kurt Angle joined Impact this autumn, it would be Joe he'd be immediately put into a program with, as everyone knew the Californian would be able to get the best out of the Olympic gold medalist. And boy did this pairing pay off, because following two excellent matches at Genesis and Turning Point respectively, TNA reached what to this day probably still stands as its high watermark in terms of critical acclaim. Really, for longtime fans of the product, this was the golden era of the show. And while Kurt Angle certainly has a large part to play in that, even he would have to admit that back in 2006, for as great as he was playing second fiddle to arguably the best wrestler in the entire world in the Samoan submission machine. But Kurt wouldn't be playing second fiddle for long. No, by the time 2007 came around, it would be him who'd be standing tall as the best wrestler in TNA. What put Kurt Angle over the top in 2007 to make him a better choice than Samoa Joe or AJ Styles as the ace of TNA? Well, by this point, it was clear he was taking the company to peaks it had never seen before, and in some ways, would never see again. Sure, part of this was because he'd come in from WWE just a year prior as one of the biggest stars on that roster, so it was obvious he was going to have an impact, no pun intended. But it wasn't like the Olympic hero didn't earn his spot here. No, this wasn't a case of someone coming from a bigger company and coasting. Hell, in 2007 TNA, Kurt Angle had something to prove, and he certainly made it clear here that he was still one of the best, if not the best wrestler in the world. How would he do that? Well, aside from his stellar matches, he'd also become the first ever TNA World Champion, as well as the man who at one point held every men's belt in the promotion simultaneously in a scene which would have made even 2025 Mercedes Moné blush. That said, come 2008, it would be back to an old stalwart taking up that mantle of best wrestler in the Impact Zone, as that year, it would once again be all about Samoa Joe. Come on now, there was no way we could go with anyone else in this spot, as it was in 2008 that finally, after 3 years of chasing, Samoa Joe won the big one when he beat Kurt Angle to become a world champion in Nashville, specifically the TNA World Heavyweight Champion. Needless to say then, this was a major moment for the Samoan submission machine, and one which would stand right up there with his biggest career achievements. And now that he was a champion, Joe would waste no time in proving why he deserved the spot as he went on a string of great defenses. Booker T, Christian Cage, Sting. It didn't matter who the Californian came up against here, he always stole the show with them. Sure, it would be the latter performer who took the belt away from Joe, meaning he wouldn't get to close out 2008 with it still around his waist, but that didn't matter too much, as by that point he'd already proven himself as a true top guy. Would this make him the top guy in 2009 too, though? Well, no, because that year we'd be going back to the start again in some ways, as this was another year which belonged to AJ Styles. Now, we should clarify here that throughout the entire decade, AJ had been one of the top acts in TNA. Hell, even when he wasn't the absolute #1 focused upon guy and was instead playing second fiddle to a Samoa Joe or a Kurt Angle, he was still very much the ace as far as many fans were concerned. Come 2009, however, not only would he be the people's choice, he'd also be the company's choice once more. How did this happen? Well, this was the year that AJ became one of the key parts of Impact's original Resistance stable, as they took on the mighty heel faction made up of Booker T, Sting, Kevin Nash, and Scott Steiner. Yes, this was the point the main event Mafia fully dominated TNA TV. So if the promotion had any hopes of fending off this all-consuming force, they were going to need the phenomenal one to be at his best. And that would all lead us to the cathartic moment where, at No Surrender in September of that year, he was able to win a 5-way bout against Angle, Sting, Matt Morgan, and Hernandez to become the TNA World Champion for the first time. But this wouldn't be enough to keep AJ on top again in 2010. No, as the new decade dawned, momentum would instead shift back over to Kurt Angle. Now, 2010 was a very interesting year for TNA. In many ways, in fact, it was their most important year, as this was the point when, with Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff coming on board, the company had lost much of its original identity and started a downward trajectory which it would take them a long time to come out of. But it wasn't all bad news here, as there were still some high points to be found down in the Impact Zone, with maybe the biggest of those being Kurt Angle. What was he doing in 2010 that was so special? Well, it wasn't like the Pittsburgh native was doing anything new. It was more that he was continuing to operate at full capacity, and this put him a level above everyone else. After all, this was the year he reached what would arguably be the peak of his ongoing rivalry with AJ Styles, just as it was also the year he'd helped Mr. Anderson get acclimatized to his new home down in Nashville. So when picking a best TNA wrestler for the start of the 2010s, Kurt Angle is clearly the best choice to go with, just as the best choice to go with in the spot for 2011 is our next entry, Bobby Roode. That's right, after years of a small group dominating the scene in terms of who was the best in the Impact Zone during any given calendar year, 2011 was the year that someone new broke through, and that person would be none other than Bobby Roode. What did he do to reach this level? Well, for one, it would be in 2011 that, after a very successful tag team run with his Beer Money Inc. partner James Storm, he finally reached the mountaintop when he became TNA World Champion. Obviously then, this was a major career moment for the Canadian, as he fully solidified himself as not just a singles guy, but a singles guy who could stand right up there with the best of them. But then one look at Roode back during the start of the 2010s should have been enough to tell you he was in that category, because with an in-ring style which aped Triple H and a look that was money to say the least, well, he was deserving of rising all the way to the peak. And similar things could be said for our choice of best TNA wrestler of 2012 as it happens. Who are we talking about here? Why, Austin Aries, of course. Now, Austin Aries isn't someone who many people would put on their overall Mount Rushmore of TNA or anything, but back during the early 2010s, he was easily one of the standout acts of the entire promotion. As being one of the better wrestlers on the roster, he was regularly able to steal the show when he took part in things like X Division matches. Of course, 2012 would see him reach another level altogether though, as that was the year he became world champion too. Yes, like with Bobby Roode in 2011, 2012 saw Austin Aries break through that glass ceiling in a way few thought he'd ever be able to. And boy did he take advantage of this new push, as over the months which followed, he'd defend the title with pride as he established himself as a major player in the next generation of the company. Would this mean he'd still be that guy come 2013? Well, no, because 2013 would once again see the ace of the Nashville promotion, AJ Styles, level up to another stage of his career. Of course, there is a sense of bittersweetness to this one, however, as while 2013 was another great year for AJ down in the Impact Zone, it would also be his last year there, because after he won the TNA World title in October, he'd go on something of a Summer of Punk style storyline. Why was that? Well, with Impact starting to really struggle financially here, they weren't willing to pay the Phenomenal One what he wanted during contract negotiations. And that led us to a point where, come the end of the year, Styles would have one foot out the door. As you'd expect then, this meant that in the storyline at least, he was threatening to leave with the belt, meaning Dixie Carter was desperate to get it off him before he left. Would this happen in the end? Yes, it would, and it would signify the swan song of perhaps TNA's top guy to ever do it, their equivalent of a Steve Austin in WWE or Ric Flair in WCW. But while this was the end of an era, a new one would be about to take its place. And in 2014, the new era would be solidified by an all-new best wrestler in the company in the form of Bobby Lashley. That's right, while 2014 wasn't the first time the Almighty had appeared inside of a TNA ring, it was the point that he fully leveled up to the top of the card, as it was here that he became their world champion. And this was something which was badly needed for the brand, as with this being the start of a lengthy dark age for them, anyone who could keep things afloat was more than welcome. So if you were still a fan of Impact during the mid-2010s, you likely took great joy in watching Lashley whenever he was on screen. But it wasn't just his world title reign which made Bobby Lashley the best TNA wrestler of 2014. No, it was also the fact that it was here he created the Beatdown Clan alongside MVP and Kenny King, the precursor to what would eventually become known as both the Hurt Business and the Hurt Syndicate in WWE and AEW respectively. Obviously then, when we're choosing a top guy for this period in TNA's history, it really has to be Lashley in that spot. And when it comes to that same top spot in 2015, well, that honor has to go to another rising star of the time, EC3. Unlike Bobby Lashley, though, Ethan Carter III wasn't someone who'd already established himself in WWE prior to his run in TNA during the mid-2010s. No, prior to this, he was very much an indie guy who had that brief run on NXT back when it was in its original game show format. Luckily for him, however, when he joined the Impact roster in 2013, he'd be given a winner of a gimmick in the rich and bratty nephew of Dixie Carter, with this quickly seeing him rise up to the top of the card. So far would he rise up in such a short space of time, in fact, come June of 2015 he'd be the TNA World Champion. And that was a belt EC3 would hold on to for the next 4 months from there as he further established himself as the next big thing on the brand. But even that wouldn't be enough to keep him on top as the best Impact wrestler when 2016 came around. No, here things would once again swing back around to Bobby Lashley. Why was Bobby Lashley once again the guy in 2016 TNA after having been usurped in that role the year prior by EC3? Well, this was the year he regained the world title down in Nashville, and in doing so then, he made it clear to everyone that he wasn't willing to give up his spot as the most dominating force in the brand. But it wasn't just the world title that Lashley held in 2016, no, he'd also at one point become both X Division and King of the Mountain champion as well. So really, there was a sense that this was the most anyone had taken over the company's main event scene since the days of Kurt Angle holding all the gold. Eddie Edwards, EC3, Drew Galloway, it didn't matter who the Kansas City native went up against here. He was able to beat everyone in convincing fashion in a way which left little doubt about the fact that he was the guy on top. But by the time 2017 came around, the Almighty would be on the verge of heading back to WWE again, and this left a spot open for a new best wrestler in TNA, a spot which was filled by Eli Drake. Yeah. Of course, today, most people know Eli Drake as LA Knight, former United States champion. But back before he was riding high in the upper mid-card of SmackDown, this Maryland native was making a name for himself in the smaller brand of Impact, there honing a character which would later go on to make him famous. Yes, everything you like about the LA Knight character began here, even his "yeah" catchphrase, so it's no surprise that in the Impact Zone back in 2017, he was very popular with the fan base. Where would this take him in terms of in-ring success? Well, all the way to the world title. And while he was doing that, he'd also do a great job during his bouts against both Johnny Impact and Alberto El Patron, with him more than holding his own on the ring canvas here. So don't let it go forgotten that before he was WWE's biggest cult sensation, Eli Drake was a TNA guy. One person who'd never find the same success over in WWE, however, would be the best Impact act of 2018, the man known as Sami Callihan. Okay, Sami Callihan is another name which might not jump to mind when people talk about the Mount Rushmore of TNA or anything, but in 2018 he was certainly a force to be reckoned with on the Impact roster. Sure, a part of the reason for this was because the roster wasn't what it had once been then. That said, none of this can take away from the fact that the man who'd flopped in NXT as Solomon Crow was able to rebuild himself very well here as a psycho heel in the vein of his real-life friend, Jon Moxley. Really, with this being the era when Mox was still playing the Dean Ambrose character, you could argue Sami Callihan was the best example of an unpredictable lunatic in wrestling during 2018. And that made everything he did must-see TV, as you never knew if things were going to go off the rails or not, particularly during his memorable feud with Eddie Edwards or his mask versus hair match with Pentagon Jr. at Slammiversary. But even this wouldn't be enough to keep the Ohio native in that spot come 2019, as 2019 would very much be the year of Tessa Blanchard. That's right, while her star might have fallen dramatically in the years since, back at the turn of the decade, Tessa Blanchard was on the verge of reaching true superstardom, and the way she was doing this was by catching fire in TNA to the point that she was turning into their top act overall. Yes, like with Becky Lynch over in WWE around the same time, this was a groundbreaking move in terms of a woman breaking through a glass ceiling and standing on the same level as the men. Need any evidence of just how high Tessa rose here? Well, how about the fact it would be in 2019 that she became the first, and to date only woman, to ever hold the TNA World title? Sure, with scandal causing her to fall immediately after this, she didn't get to enjoy any of the fruits of being champion, but she was champion nevertheless, and that makes her the easy choice for top TNA act of this year. Of course, she wouldn't be the only woman to ever have this spot though, as the very next year it would be another lady in that position, a lady by the name of Deonna Purrazzo. No, Deonna Purrazzo would never reach the same heights as Tessa Blanchard had the year prior when she won a men's world title, but the New Jersey native didn't need to do this in order to become TNA's best performer of 2020. All she had to do instead was have a great run as Knockouts champion as she beat challenger after challenger with her Dean Malenko-infused mat-based submission style. After all, this was a year where, for obvious reasons, Impact had never struggled more, so having Deonna there to provide a solid bout whenever she was wrestling was exactly what was needed for the promotion. And on top of that, it also helped the virtuoso to build herself after her WWE run came to an abrupt end not long before this. Come 2021 though, she wouldn't be able to hold on to that spot of the top TNA act, as it would instead move back over to the men with the walking weapon himself, Josh Alexander. What made Josh Alexander the standout of 2021 TNA? Well, as the world was starting to open up again, it would be him who helped to keep the company afloat with his excellent singles run, one which featured matches like his memorable 60-minute Iron Man bout against TJP. Obviously then, if there was anyone who deserved to hold the world title here, however briefly, when he took it back from AEW star Christian Cage, it was him, as he was quite possibly the best pure wrestler on the roster at that point. But it wouldn't just be the world title the walking weapon had around his waist over the course of 2021. No, he'd also hold the X Division title for a while too, something which only further cemented the fact that he was not the same guy who had been teaming up with Ethan Page only a year prior. So really, this represented the point that Alexander fully elevated himself to the level of main event player, and that elevation would continue as 2022 came around, because as far as we're concerned, he's also the best TNA wrestler of this year too. Yes, if 2021 was the year that Josh Alexander suffered heartbreak when his TNA World title run was cut short mere minutes into it after Moose cashed in his Call Your Shot contract on him, 2022 was the year the walking weapon managed to find redemption, and the way he did so was by reclaiming the top prize at Rebellion in April April, and from there, embarking on the longest reign anyone has ever had with that particular piece of hardware at 335 days. As you would expect then, this would mean anyone who came up against him was sent packing and forced to lick their wounds, as he was not going to be giving up his top spot anytime soon. It didn't matter if it was Eddie Edwards, Alex Shelley, Speedball Mike Bailey, or New Japan Pro Wrestling Stone Pitbull himself, Tomohiro Ishii. Everyone fell to the might of the champ here. And that meant as the year drew to a close, it was academic as to who was going to be the best act TNA had produced during that 12-month period, with there being no other option than the Canadian. Unfortunately though, Josh Alexander would not be able to three-peat in 2023, as that year the undisputed king of the Impact Zone would be none other than Alex Shelley. Now come 2023, Alex Shelley was already a well-respected and highly decorated performer, what with him being a multiple-time TNA Tag Team Champion alongside his Motor City Machine Guns partner Chris Sabin. But one thing he'd never been able to do before this was prove he could reach the top of the mountain in the singles division. Thankfully then, all this would change here, as it would be against all odds in June that Shelley went up against the then TNA World Champion Steve Maclin and beat him right in the middle of the ring in order to take the gold home for himself. That's right, after years of being a stellar tag team guy, finally the Detroit native had reached the pinnacle in the singles division too, with him from there going on to defend against a who's who of the Impact roster in 2023. We're talking about names like Nick Aldis, Josh Alexander, and Jonathan Gresham here. So as far as we're concerned, he's a lock for the best thing the company produced back then, just as it's a lock that the best thing TNA produced in 2024 was Joe Hendry. Now here was a lightning in the bottle moment if there ever was one. After all, it was in 2024 that after Joe Hendry became somewhat of a cult sensation online when he managed to meme his theme song all the way to a high position on the UK downloads chart, he found that a lot of wrestling fans who had never seen him before were suddenly taking notice of him. And this even helped to give TNA a bit of a boost too, as some of his segments, mainly the concerts he did for his then rival AJ Francis, became amongst the most watched in years for Impact. Understandably then, his run as digital media champion around this time was very well received by fans of the product, as was his eventual rise up to the main event scene as he began to chase after the world title too. That said, while Hendry would eventually get that world title in 2025, it wouldn't be him who was the top star of that year. No, instead, that honor would go to Mike Santana. What a turnaround this has been, because after leaving AEW in 2024, there were many who felt that Mike Santana was going to fade away into obscurity, but choosing to rebuild himself on the smaller stage of TNA, where there was going to be less weight placed on his shoulders, and as such, more time to develop, he was able to reinvent himself as a top act up in Toronto. Hell, pretty early on in the year, it became apparent that he, and not Joe Hendry, was the guy for the long term. And this would all lead to a great feel-good moment when, after initially failing to get the job done at Slammiversary, Santana would finally beat Trick Williams to bring home the world title for his promotion at Bound for Glory in October. Where will he go from here now that he's the man? Well, we expect a lengthy and successful title run to happen next. And when that's over, we imagine Mike will either continue to stand tall as TNA's ace, or move on to NXT and there start the process of rising up that roster too. Whatever he does though, he's already earned his spot amongst the ranks of the best wrestlers from each year of TNA's existence, just like everyone else we've looked at today has.